The cashier at Miller's Hardware looked at me with pity as Brenda walked out of the store, her hand in another man's, my wife of 8 years, right there in the fluorescent light, without a backward glance. My breath caught, air sucked out of my lungs, leaving me hollow. Guess some women just need a change of scenery, the old man behind the counter mumbled, his words a final, crushing blow. The coffee in the chipped mug had cooled, a thin film on its surface. Dale sat in a booth at Betty's Diner, on the quiet edge of town, watching a light drizzle speckle the window. The scent of stale fries and disinfectant hung in the air. Most mornings, he'd be halfway through his workday at the lumberyard, but today the hum of the old refrigerator case was the only sound he could focus on, a low thrum that mirrored the dull ache in his chest. It had been 4 days since Gary's call. Gary worked the night shift as a dispatcher for the county. He wasn't the type for gossip, usually just the facts. His voice had been flat, almost apologetic, when he called on Tuesday afternoon. Dale, I think I saw Brenda's car outside the Hilton on 5th Street today. Around 1 o'clock. Dale remembered the exact time Gary said it. 1 o'clock. The words had settled in his ear like lead. Brenda drove a specific shade of red Mazda, a few years old, with a distinct crescent-shaped dent above the rear passenger wheel, from a parking lot mishap last spring. There was no mistaking it. She was supposed to be in a meeting downtown, at her advertising firm, working through lunch. An important client, she'd said. Dale had tried to argue it away. Maybe she was meeting a client there, maybe it was a colleague's car. But the cold truth was already forming a knot deep in his gut, tightening with each shallow breath. He'd known. On some level, for months, he'd seen the shift, the extra late nights, the sudden interest in new clothes, the way her phone was always face down on the counter. He had chosen to ignore it, to busy himself with estimates and lumber orders, to believe the easy answers. Thanks for letting me know, Gary, he'd managed to say, the words catching in his throat, a dry whisper barely audible over the phone line. He had hung up, the receiver feeling impossibly heavy in his hand. Brenda came home that evening, her usual cheerful self, chattering about her day, about the new account they were trying to land. She moved through their small kitchen, humming, pulling ingredients for dinner from the fridge. Dale watched her, stirring a spoon aimlessly through his coffee, feeling like a stranger in his own house. Her laughter, once familiar and comforting, now sounded brittle. A thin veneer over something he couldn't quite grasp. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the slight frown when she concentrated. All these small habits suddenly felt foreign, observed from a great distance. She turned from the stove, sensing his quietness. Dale, are you okay? You seem distracted. Her eyes, usually so direct, darted away as she asked. He forced a smile, a practiced movement. Yeah, just tired. Long day at work. The lie felt heavy on his tongue, a bitter taste. She'd walked over, kissed his cheek, a fleeting touch that offered no comfort, only a deeper sense of disconnection. Her lips were cool against his skin. Later, lying in bed, the familiar weight of Brenda beside him, her soft, steady breathing filling the quiet room, Dale felt like he was drowning. He stared at the ceiling, tracing the faint cracks in the plaster, the shadows cast by the streetlight outside. Sleep wouldn't come. Each breath she took seemed to pull him further into a silent, suffocating sea of doubt, the current of suspicion dragging him deeper. He tried to reconcile the woman beside him with Gary's casual observation, and the gap felt vast, impossible to bridge. The next day, a hard, clear decision solidified. He couldn't live with this not knowing. The quiet agony of uncertainty was worse than any truth. He needed proof, undeniable and tangible. Something concrete to hold on to. He needed to be sure. He drove to a large electronics store 10 miles out of town, feeling a strange mix of dread and grim determination. He bought a small, powerful GPS tracker and a miniature audio recorder, explaining to the young man behind the counter that they were for his son's new car. Just to keep track of him. You know how kids are. The guilt gnawed at him, a dull ache beneath his ribs, but he pushed it down. He needed to know. He drove home. The small packages tucked under the seat. Brenda was in the shower, the sound of water drumming against the tile. Dale moved quickly, his hands steady despite the tremor in his stomach. He slipped the tracker under the rear bumper of her Mazda, the magnetic base clicking firmly into place. Then, he secured the audio recorder beneath the passenger seat, hidden from view. He worked with a surgeon's precision, his face impassive. When he was done, he closed the car door, the soft thud echoing the finality of his actions. He took a slow breath, the air still thick with her scented shampoo from the bathroom. The next week blurred into a pattern of strained, quiet, and constant anxiety. Every time his phone vibrated, Dale's stomach tightened, a familiar clenching beneath his ribs. He'd glance at the screen, hoping for a text from the lumberyard, a mundane notification, anything but the blank space where the GPS app usually sat dormant. Every morning, when Brenda backed her red Mazda out of the driveway, Dale would watch from the living room window, a knot forming in his throat. Where was she really going? He imagined the small device, tucked away, silently tracking, recording. The thought of it made his skin prickle, a mix of guilt and cold resolve. Their conversations grew thinner, stretched out by pauses that felt like chasms. Brenda would talk about her day, her voice sounding unnaturally bright to Dale. He'd offer grunts, monosyllabic answers, his mind elsewhere, listening for nuances, for cracks in her cheerful facade. He found himself picking at his food at dinner, the clinking of his fork against the plate unnervingly loud in the quiet kitchen. He watched her, looking for tells, for changes in her expression, but she seemed the same, or perhaps he was just too blind to see it. One evening, as they moved through the familiar ritual of getting ready for bed, Brenda turned from the dresser, her hand resting on a stack of folded shirts. Her expression was softer than usual, a faint line etched between her brows. "Dale, is everything okay? You've been acting strange." She didn't raise her voice, but the question hung in the air, heavy and direct. Dale froze, his toothbrush halfway to his mouth, a dollop of white paste clinging to the bristles. He met her gaze in the mirror, his own eyes wide, caught. "Everything's fine," he mumbled around the toothbrush, pulling it away. "Just work. You know how it is. Budget crunch, layoffs talking." He rinsed his mouth, the lie tasting like stale metal. He avoided looking directly at her, focusing on the toothpaste foam swirling down the drain. Brenda didn't look convinced. She stepped closer, her hand lightly touching his arm. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right? I'm here for you." Her voice was earnest, a familiar comfort he'd once relied on. The irony of her words hit Dale with the force of a punch. Talk to her? About the tracker in her car? About Gary's call? About the gaping hole in his gut? He swallowed hard, the muscles in his throat tight. He couldn't speak, not without giving something away. He nodded, a jerky motion, and retreated further into the bathroom, shutting the door behind him, needing a moment, a wall between them. He leaned against the cool tile, listening to the soft sounds of her moving about the bedroom, her familiar presence now a source of agony. Then, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, it happened. The house was still. Brenda had left around noon, saying she was going shopping with Sarah, maybe grabbing lunch at the new bistro downtown. Dale had watched her go, then retreated to his small home office, the room filled with the faint scent of old paper and dust. He was supposedly catching up on paperwork for the lumberyard, stacks of invoices scattered across his desk, but his gaze kept drifting to the laptop screen, where the GPS application glowed, a small blue dot representing Brenda's car. He watched it move, steadily, purposefully. It wasn't heading towards the mall, or downtown. It was cutting across town, taking the route directly to 5th Street, to the Hilton. His hand started to tremble, a fine tremor he couldn't control. He watched, breath held tight in his chest, as the little blue dot slowed, then stopped. Right in the Hilton parking lot. He waited, his ears ringing with the silence of the house, his heart thudding against his ribs. He clicked on the audio feed, a cold dread washing over him. A faint hiss, then a car door slammed shut, heavy and distinct. Footsteps crunched on gravel, then silence. He strained, leaning closer to the screen, willing the sound to be clearer. "Hey, handsome," a voice, sickeningly familiar, came through the speakers. "Mitch." Dale recognized it instantly, the low timbre, the casual confidence. Mitch from Brenda's old firm, the one who'd always lingered a little too long when he dropped Brenda off after late-night meetings. "Hey, handsome," Brenda replied, her voice light, airy, flirtatious, a tone Dale hadn't heard directed at him in years. It was full of a warmth and excitement that pierced him deeper than any accusation. "I've been looking forward to this all week." A brief rustling sound. Then the undeniable, unmistakable sound of kissing. Soft, intimate, prolonged. Dale slammed his laptop shut, the abrupt noise echoing in the small room. Bile rose in his throat, hot and acrid. The proof. He had his proof. The next few days bled into each other, a constant thrum of static in Dale's mind. Sleep came in ragged bursts, punctuated by sharp, vivid replays of Brenda's voice, of Mitch's low handsome, of the soft, intimate sounds. He felt a hollowness in his gut, a gnawing ache that no amount of food could fill. He subsisted on coffee and whatever he could force himself to chew, the taste of it like sawdust. He threw himself into gathering more evidence, a grim, methodical pursuit. Late at night, after Brenda was asleep, he'd sit at their shared computer, his fingers moving stiffly over the keyboard. He found the hotel records first, charges for a room at the Hilton, always on a Tuesday or Thursday afternoon, coinciding with Brenda's late meetings. He traced email exchanges, innocent on the surface, but with coded language he now understood, veiled references to our lunch date or catching up. He even found a receipt for a small, expensive gift. A watch. Purchased from a boutique Brenda had mentioned admiring for Mitch. Each new piece of information was like a fresh cut, a knife twisting deeper. Not in his gut, but in some soft, vital organ he didn't even know he possessed. Brenda, of course, noticed. How could she not? His silence had grown heavier, his gaze more distant. She tried to bridge the gap. "Want to watch that new documentary, Dale?" she'd ask, her hand lightly touching his arm as he stared at the evening news. He'd flinch, imperceptibly. At her touch, the warmth of her fingers feeling like a calculated lie. A performance. "No, I'm good," he'd say, without turning, focusing on the sports scores scrolling across the bottom of the screen. Every smile she offered him, every small gesture of affection, felt hollow, an insult to the knowledge he carried. One night, as Dale sat hunched over the kitchen table, the scattered credit card statements illuminated by the single overhead light, Brenda walked in. The house was quiet, the faint smell of roasted chicken from dinner still lingering. Dale had been tracing a series of small, unexplained cash withdrawals, feeling a cold fury build. "Dale, we need to talk," she said, her voice soft, but with a slight tremor that caught his attention. He looked up, his heart immediately beginning to pound, a frantic drum against his ribs. Was this it? Was she finally going to confess? Was the weight of her deceit finally too much for her to bear? He tightened his grip on the edge of the table, bracing himself. Brenda took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling. She smoothed her hands over her nightgown. I think we should see a marriage counselor." Her words hung in the air, unexpected, yet strangely predictable. "We've been so distant lately, and I don't know how to fix it." She stepped closer, her expression earnest, her eyes searching his. "Please, Dale, I love you. I want us to be okay." The sincerity in her eyes, the gentle pleading in her voice, nearly broke him. How could she stand there, professing love, her face etched with what looked like genuine concern, while sneaking around with Mitch, exchanging intimate words and touches? He wanted to scream, to grab the printouts from the table and throw them in her face, to unleash the torrent of betrayal he felt. The urge was physical, a burning sensation behind his eyes, but he held back. He swallowed the bitter words, the hot, rising anger. Someone else deserved to know the truth first. Someone else deserved to hear it from him, not from Brenda, not from some counselor. "Okay," Dale said, his voice flat, hollow. It sounded like someone else's voice, distant and devoid of emotion. "We can look into it." The relief on Brenda's face was palpable. It washed over her, softening the lines of worry around her mouth. She came over to him, Her arms circling his neck, she pressed her face against his shoulder, holding him tightly. "Thank you, Dale," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We're going to be okay, I promise." As he held her, feeling her warmth, the familiar curve of her back against his arm, a sickening thought rose unbidden. How many times had she held Mitch like this? How many times had she whispered promises? Her body pressed close to his. The thought made him feel cold all over, a profound chill that settled deep into his bones. The next morning, after Brenda had left for work, Dale sat at the kitchen table, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. The offer of marriage counseling still hung in the air, a fragile thread. He knew he couldn't go through with it, not with the lie still festering. There was something else he had to do first, a debt to pay, a truth to deliver. He found Sarah's number in his phone. She was Mitch's wife, and she deserved to hear it, even if it shattered her world. It was a cold thought, but a necessary one. He dialed, his finger feeling heavy on the screen. Sarah answered, her voice bright, unsuspecting. "Hey, Dale. Everything all right?" "Sarah, I need to talk to you," he said, his voice flatter than he intended. "Can you meet me? At the Copper Kettle, maybe? In about an hour?" The Copper Kettle was a small, unassuming place on the other side of town, far enough from their usual haunts. She paused, a beat of confusion in the silence. "Sure, Dale. Is everything okay? You sound serious." "It's important," he replied, giving her no further detail. "See you then." He hung up before she could ask more questions. He needed to get this over with. He felt no pleasure in what he was about to do, only a grim, bone-deep weariness. The Copper Kettle was quiet, mostly empty. Dale picked a booth in the back, near the window, watching the few cars pass by. He ordered a black coffee, something strong to cut through the haze in his head. 10 minutes later, Sarah walked in, her gaze scanning the room. She spotted him, a slight frown of concern on her face. She was a pleasant woman, always kind, with a quick smile and a dry wit. He thought of her laugh, the way she brightened a room. The thought made the task ahead even harder. "Dale, what's going on?" she asked, sliding into the booth across from him. Her eyes, usually sparkling, were wide with a mix of surprise and apprehension. She had on a light blue sweater, a shade that always suited her. She looked at him expectantly, her hands clasped on the table. Dale took a deep breath, the stale air of the diner filling his lungs. There was no easy way to say it, no gentle words to soften the blow. He had chosen blunt honesty, a clean cut. "Sarah, there's no easy way to say this, so I'm just going to come out with it. Brenda and Mitch are having an affair." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and unwelcome. Sarah's face went pale, the color draining from her cheeks, leaving her skin almost translucent. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. "What?" she whispered, the sound barely audible. "No, that's not possible. Mitch would never." Her voice trailed off, her eyes fixed on his, searching for a lie, for a sign he was joking. Her hands, which had been clasped, now gripped the edge of the table. Dale didn't say anything. He just reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and unlocked it. He navigated to the audio recording, his thumb pressing play. The hiss of static filled the small space, then the distinct sound of a car door slamming, footsteps on gravel. "Hey, handsome," Mitch's voice, unmistakably clear, flowed from the phone speaker. "Hey, handsome," Brenda replied, her voice light and flirtatious, devoid of the careful pleasantness she used with Dale. "I've been looking forward to this all week." Then came the sound of kissing, soft but unmistakable, amplified by the tiny speaker. Dale watched Sarah's face as the sounds played out. The initial disbelief morphed into shock, a wide-eyed horror, then her jaw tightened, a flash of anger burning in her eyes, quickly followed by a deep, crushing sadness that settled into every line of her face. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, then another. He stopped the recording, the silence in the booth, thick and painful. Sarah just stared at the phone, then at him, her chest heaving slightly. "How long have you known?" she whispered, her voice raw, cracking on the last word. "About a week," Dale replied, his own voice sounding distant, detached. He felt nothing but a quiet sense of duty. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I thought you deserved to know." She nodded, not looking at him, her gaze fixed on some point beyond his shoulder. Tears streamed freely down her face now, silent and steady. She reached for a napkin, dabbing at her eyes. "Thank you for telling me," she said, her voice thin. I don't know what to do now." Dale and Sarah sat there for hours, the untouched coffee growing cold between them, the world outside the copper kettle fading from bright afternoon to the muted light of early evening. They talked in low, measured tones, sometimes pausing, sometimes resuming, tracing the jagged edges of their shattered lives. The waitress, a young woman who looked perpetually bored, refilled their water glasses without a word, sensing the heavy, unsaid things that hung in the air around them. Sarah spoke first, her voice raw, but steadier now that the initial shock had passed. She talked about Mitch, how things had been strained between them for months, how he'd been distant, preoccupied. "He said it was work," she explained, her gaze fixed on the steam rising from her fresh coffee. "Big project. Long hours." I believed him. "You know Mitch. He's always been driven." She picked at a loose thread on the tablecloth. "I tried to be understanding. Gave him space, made sure dinner was ready when he got home, no matter how late. I thought I was being a good wife." A fresh wave of tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them back. "God, I feel so stupid." Dale listened, nodding slowly, a mirror of her experience. He shared his own suspicions, the subtle shifts in Brenda's routine, the vague answers to simple questions, the way she clutched her phone. He told her about Gary's call, about the GPS tracker, about the audio recording. He left out no detail, laying it all out, the bitter truth exposed. "I kept pushing it down," he admitted, his voice low, telling myself I was paranoid, that it was just me, getting older, maybe a little insecure. I guess I didn't want to see it. He felt a strange sort of relief, speaking it all aloud. The burden lightened by the sharing. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in dull shades of orange and gray visible through the cafe window, Dale realized something unexpected had happened. In sharing their pain, in dissecting the wreckage of their marriages, Sarah and he had forged an uncommon bond. They understood each other in a way no one else could, a silent language of betrayal and disillusionment. There was no need for explanations, no need to justify their feelings. They simply knew. "What do you think we should do?" Sarah asked finally, her voice hoarse from hours of talking and quiet crying. She looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed but clear, searching for guidance, for a path forward. Dale shook his head slowly, considering. "I don't know," he said, the words heavy. Part of me wants to confront them, to walk right up, in front of everyone, and make them feel as hurt and betrayed as we do." He imagined it, a public scene, their faces crumbling under the weight of his revelations. The thought offered a fleeting, dark satisfaction, to rip their lives apart, just like they did ours. He paused, taking a slow breath. "But I don't think that's the answer." The anger, he knew, would only consume him. It wouldn't mend anything. Sarah nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. "You're right. Revenge won't make this better. It'll just make us as ugly as they are." She sighed, a long, weary sound. "But God, Dale, how do we move forward from this? How do we rebuild anything after something like this?" Dale reached across the table, his hand finding hers. Her skin was cool, and her grip was firm, a small anchor in the storm. "I don't know," he repeated, his voice softer now, less brittle. "But maybe we can figure it out together." The words hung between them, not a promise, but an offer of shared responsibility. The look Sarah gave him then a mix of gratitude for his honesty, understanding for his pain, and something else Dale couldn't quite name. Something fragile but undeniably hopeful made him feel a glimmer of light, a faint warmth spreading through the cold emptiness he'd carried for weeks. It was a feeling he hadn't known he still possessed. As their shared burden started to lighten, a new path seemed to slowly materialize. Stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. Over the next few weeks, Dale and Sarah met regularly. They started with coffee, then moved to longer lunches, and eventually, quiet evenings at his place or hers. After Brenda and Mitch were out or asleep, they talked for hours, sometimes until the small hours of the morning, their voices low, sharing the intricate details of their broken marriages, their once cherished hopes, their gnawing fears for the future. They cried together, the tears flowing easily, released by the understanding gaze of another who knew exactly what they were feeling. They also found themselves laughing, sometimes at the absurdities of their situations, sometimes at the shared memories of happier times that now felt so distant. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they started to heal, not separately, but together, patching up the raw wounds with shared vulnerability and quiet companionship. The cold knot in Dale's gut began to loosen, replaced by a tentative warmth. Somewhere along the way, something fundamental shifted between them. The platonic comfort of shared grief began to deepen, to take on a new texture, a subtle undercurrent that hummed beneath their conversations. Dale found himself looking forward to seeing Sarah, not just for the catharsis of talking, but for the quiet pleasure of her company. Her presence felt natural, like a missing piece he hadn't known was gone. One crisp autumn afternoon, they were walking in the local park, the fallen leaves crunching like brittle secrets beneath their feet. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. They had been talking about their plans for the upcoming holiday season, a conversation filled with an awkward emptiness as they both considered how to navigate it in their current circumstances. Sarah stopped suddenly near an old oak tree, its branches already bare, reaching like skeletal fingers towards the gray sky. She turned to him, her eyes serious, a flicker of something uncertain in their depths. "Dale, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice softer than usual. He felt a tremor of anticipation, a premonition of what was to come. "What is it?" he asked, his own voice sounding tight. She took a deep breath, the cold air expanding her chest. I think I'm falling for you. And it terrifies me." Dale stood there, stunned, the words echoing in the quiet park. A part of him had known this was happening, had felt the same stirrings in his own heart, a warmth, a pull, a longing he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge, but hearing her say it out loud, giving voice to the unspoken, made it suddenly, undeniably real. The implications of it washed over him, exhilarating and terrifying all at once. "Sarah." He started, his mind racing, trying to find the right words, to articulate the complicated swirl of emotions within him, but she cut him off, her hand reaching out to touch his arm, her fingers light. "No, let me finish. I know this is crazy. We're both still married. We're both still hurting. Our lives are a mess right now. But when I'm with you, Dale, I feel whole again. Like maybe everything that happened, all the pain, all the betrayal, was leading us here. To this moment." Dale stepped closer to her, his heart pounding a furious rhythm against his ribs. He looked into her eyes, seeing the raw honesty there, the fear mixed with a nascent hope. "I feel it too," he admitted, the words escaping him almost involuntarily, a confession he couldn't hold back. A small, hesitant smile touched her lips. "But are we just rebounding?" she asked, her voice laced with doubt. "Are we just hurt, and looking for comfort in the closest available person?" She shook her head, a determined spark in her eyes. "Maybe that's how it started. Maybe we sought each other out because we were broken. But this feels different, Dale. This feels real." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones, feeling the softness of her skin. He searched her eyes, finding no falsehood, only a genuine, vulnerable truth. Then, before he could overthink it, before the doubts could fully take hold, he leaned down and kissed her. It was soft and tentative at first, a question more than an answer, but as her lips parted beneath his, it quickly deepened into something passionate and earnest. A silent promise. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless, the autumn air suddenly feeling thin. Sarah's eyes were wide, her cheeks flushed. "What do we do now?" she whispered, her voice fragile. "I don't know," Dale replied honestly, his own voice rough with emotion. He reached for her hand again, intertwining their fingers. But I know I don't want to let this go. The kiss in the park had opened a new, complicated chapter. The guilt of their growing feelings for each other wrestled constantly with the undeniable excitement of this new, unexpected love. It felt wrong, yet profoundly right, a bewildering paradox that Dale couldn't reconcile. They agreed to take things slow, to figure out their respective marriages before pursuing anything further. But the connection between them was a palpable, living thing, throbbing beneath the surface of their guarded conversations. It was in the lingering touch of their hands, the way their eyes met across a crowded room, the comfortable silence that settled between them. As the weeks passed, the weight of the secrets Dale was keeping became unbearable. The tracker was still in Brenda's car, the audio recorder too, though he rarely listened anymore. The evidence was simply a fact now, a cold, hard truth. But the secrets, his knowledge of her affair, his own burgeoning feelings for Sarah, those were what truly crushed him. He couldn't look at Brenda without feeling a complex mix of anger at her betrayal, the lingering sting of his own hurt, and a new, heavy guilt that clung to him like a second skin. He felt like a hypocrite, a man playing a part he no longer believed in. Their attempts at normalcy felt forced and hollow, like poorly acted scenes in a play. They ate dinner across from each other, exchanged polite inquiries about their days, but the conversation was superficial, lacking any genuine warmth or depth. The silence in the house grew heavier, a palpable presence that pressed down on them, filling the spaces between their strained words. The marriage counseling Brenda had suggested still hadn't materialized. Every time she brought it up, Dale found an excuse. Another delay. He knew he couldn't sit in a room with a counselor and Brenda, pretending to work on a marriage he already felt was dead, especially with his heart stirring for another woman. One night, the air in the dining room was particularly thick with unspoken words. They were halfway through a silent dinner of baked chicken and potatoes, the only sound the clinking of silverware against ceramic plates. Brenda suddenly put down her fork, the sound sharp in the quiet room. She looked at him, her gaze direct and unblinking. "Dale, what's happening to us?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through the heavy silence. There was no accusation in her tone, only a deep weariness, a profound sadness. He met her gaze across the table, seeing the pain and confusion in her eyes. For a moment, a sudden, powerful urge rose in him to come clean, to rip off the bandage and expose all the festering wounds beneath, to tell her everything he knew about her and Mitch, to confess his own new feelings for Sarah, to lay out all the ugly, convoluted truths, to just purge it all, no matter the cost. He imagined the words pouring out, a torrent of confession. And for a fleeting second, it felt like freedom. But the words stuck in his throat, a heavy, unmoving knot. They were too big, too complicated, too intertwined with his own burgeoning hope for a different future. The thought of her reaction, the inevitable explosion, held him back. He wasn't ready for that kind of confrontation. Not yet. Not when his own path was still so unclear, so fraught with its own moral compromises. I don't know," he said instead, the words feeling utterly insufficient, a flimsy shield against the torrent of truth. He looked down at his plate, unable to hold her gaze. The chicken suddenly tasted like ash. "But I think we both know it's not working anymore." The admission hung in the air, a final, quiet declaration. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to mark an end. Tears welled up in Brenda's eyes, gathering in the corners, making them seem larger, glossier. The quiet resignation that settled on her face, a tired slump to her shoulders, mirrored Dale's own bone-deep weariness. It was an unspoken surrender, an acknowledgement of the precipice they stood upon. The air in the dining room, already heavy with unspoken truths, grew dense, almost suffocating. "Is there someone else?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, thin and reedy. The question itself, asked with such a show of hurt, was laced with a familiar irony, a bitter taste that Dale couldn't ignore. It was her attempt to shift the focus, to cast him in the role of the wrongdoer. Even now. He laughed then, a short, sharp burst of sound that was devoid of humor, a brittle, hollow noise that surprised even himself. It scraped against the quiet, an ugly punctuation mark. "You tell me." "Brenda." "Is there?" he retorted, his voice low and steady, each word deliberate, carrying the weight of weeks of silent observation and painful discovery. Brenda's face, already pale, drained of even more color. Her mouth opened, then closed, a slow realization dawning in her eyes. In that moment, the subtle twitch of a muscle in her jaw, the barely perceptible widening of her pupils. Dale knew she knew that he knew. All the carefully constructed walls, the polite fictions, the brittle smiles, the unspoken pretenses, they all crumbled, collapsing silently into dust between them. There was no more hiding, no more denying, no more playing the part. Dale, I, she began, her words catching in her throat, a confession hovering on her lips, struggling to find release. Her hands trembled slightly where they rested on the table. Dale held up a hand, a decisive gesture, stopping her, cutting off the nascent confession. He didn't want to hear it, not now, not from her. The words would be too little, too late, too wrapped in her own self-preservation. The intimacy of it, the feigned contrition, would be another insult. Don't, just don't, he said, his voice flat, devoid of anger, just an overwhelming sense of finality. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw a stranger. I know about Mitch, Brenda. I know everything. A profound silence descended then, heavier than any they had known before. It swallowed the last vestiges of sound, filling the room with its crushing weight. Brenda's denial, her carefully prepared excuses, died unspoken. Stillborn in her throat, her gaze fell, fixed on the pattern of the tablecloth, unable to meet his eyes, acknowledging the undeniable truth in his words. The long, drawn-out pretense, the silent agony, the elaborate dance of lies and half-truths, was finally, irrevocably over. The consequences, raw and unyielding, lay exposed and unavoidable before them both. The living room felt vast, empty, though nothing had physically changed. The air still carried the faint scent of Brenda's perfume, a ghost of the life they had built and, just as systematically, dismantled. Dale walked to the window, watching the streetlights flick on, one by one, painting stark circles of light on the damp asphalt. It wasn't about winning, or even about getting even. It was about standing in the wreckage, surveying the damage, and figuring out how to pick up the pieces. He thought of Sarah, her quiet strength, the unexpected warmth that had begun to bloom in the barren landscape of his betrayal. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with new challenges and difficult conversations. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel entirely alone. The truth, in its brutal honesty, had finally set something free. The living room felt vast, empty, though nothing had physically changed. The air still carried the faint scent of Brenda's perfume, a faint ghost of the life they had carefully built and, just as systematically, dismantled. Dale walked to the window, watching the streetlights flick on, one by one, painting stark circles of light on the damp asphalt. There was no sense of triumph, no satisfaction, only the heavy, dead weight of what had been done, what had been said. The truth had been laid bare, ugly and unyielding. It wasn't about winning, or even about getting even. It was about standing in the wreckage, surveying the damage, and figuring out how to pick up the pieces. He thought of Sarah, her quiet strength, the unexpected warmth that had begun to bloom in the barren landscape of his betrayal. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with new challenges and difficult conversations. There would be no easy answers, no clean slate, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel entirely alone in the quiet aftermath. The truth, in its brutal honesty, had finally set something free, leaving behind a stark, cold clarity.